You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
I get this a lot, and it comes in different forms. But the basic idea is, did the flood form all of the fossils?
Okay. Well, the short answer, I think, is no. But we need to unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
And I think there are sort of various ways you could sort of approach answering this question. I think one thing we can do is we can kind of take a step back and think about, how we understand the geological record as a whole. And in particular, where do we think the flood begins and ends in the geological record?
Sure.
So we have this thing called the geological column, which we've talked about in previous episodes. We did a kind of two-part series about the geological column. Some people can look that up. But basically the geological column is a sort of idealized representation, summary of the stack of rock layers and their enclosed fossils that we find in the crust of the Earth. And when we look at that geological column, we find that fossils of different types are not uniformly distributed through that column. So, we have different subdivisions based on the types of fossils that they contain. So at the base of the geological column, we've got the Precambrian rocks, and the Precambrian rocks mostly contain fossils of microorganisms, things like bacteria and blue-green algae and things like that. Near the top of the Precambrian, there are some weird segmented and frond-like animals. I'm not even sure they're animals.
Very weird fossils.
Strange, strange fossils. And then above the Precambrian, we've got what we call the Paleozoic, and the Paleozoic contains mostly marine fossils. So we have the first appearance of hard-shelled animals at the base of the Paleozoic, and then a bit later we get things like fishes, and then we get some amphibians, and later on even some reptiles. Then we've got the Mesozoic rock layers, and those are kind of dominated by reptile-type faunas. So we've got dinosaurs and pterosaurs, and we've got marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, as well as invertebrates like ammonites. And then above the Mesozoic, we've got the Cenozoic, and the Cenozoic rock layers have different fossils again. So the Cenozoic layers are typically characterized by mammals and birds and flowering plants and things like that. So we've got this stack of rock layers, we've got the fossils in them, and the creationist looks at that geological column, and we interpret it as kind of snapshots of living organisms that were being buried, deposited at particular times in biblical history. Now, given that, as we've already established earlier, that the worldwide flood was this hugely significant geological event, the most significant geological event in the history of the world since the creation, it suggests that we ought to be able to look at that column of rocks and fossils and divide it up into at least three parts. We ought to be able to say, look, here's a part of the geological column that was formed before the flood, maybe during creation week or in the period between creation and the flood. Then there should be a portion of the record, a substantial proportion, that was formed during the flood itself. And then, we should be able to see the part of the record that was formed after the flood.
Okay.
And there's a huge amount of debate among creationists about exactly, where those boundaries lie. Where do we put the dividing line between the pre-flood and the flood, and then the flood and the post-flood? Where do we draw those lines in the record? But I think virtually everybody agrees that at least some part of the fossil record was formed after the flood, whether that's part of the Cenozoic or the whole of the Cenozoic. Those are two popular viewpoints among creationists. But in either of those positions, at least part of the Cenozoic is post-flood. So I think, when we begin to sort of break down the geological column in that way, I think we can see that, sure, there is a substantial part of the fossil-bearing portion of the geological column that was formed during the flood itself. But there are fossils that represent organisms that were buried during residual catastrophic events after the flood, as the Earth was recovering and reaching some kind of new geological equilibrium. Mm-hmm. There were depositional events that were capturing organisms, burying them in the fossil record. And, part of the column may represent organisms that were buried between the time of creation and the time of the flood, especially after the fall.
Yeah, that's a bit, I think, more difficult, would you say, to figure out. I've read a lot of papers about the post-flood fossils. That makes sense to me, but figuring out what's a pre-flood fossil, it seems much harder.
Yeah, and we also have to remember that the pre-Cambrian that we talked about mostly consists of microorganisms.
Yeah.
Right. Are they truly nephesh life?
Right.
So do they even have to be formed after the fall? Could they even have been formed, some of them during creation week itself? There are all kinds of really interesting questions. So it's quite difficult, I think, to sort of unravel all of that. But if we're thinking about the other end of the geological column, we're thinking about the end of the flood and then the post-flood period, I think, all creationists agree that at least some portion of the fossil record was formed after the flood.
Sure.
Even if it was just the Ice Age fossils, that's kind of post-flood. So the flood didn't form all of the fossils. It formed a substantial portion of them, but not all of them.
So you just heard a clip from the Let's Talk Creation podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast or hear the full episode, check out coresci.org/podcast, or hit the notification bell, hit subscribe, hit like, and you will see our podcast episodes on your regular video feed. Thanks.